Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. So over the past few days, there's been a ton of discussion online regarding the character of Vernestra Roh. Vernestra Roh first appeared in the High Republic books and will soon be appearing in the Acolyte. Now, one of the most unique aspects of Vernestra Roh is the fact that rather than a traditional lightsaber, she uses a lightsaber whip, and a lot of people have heard this and used it as ammunition for Disney, or conversely, they said this is a really cool creative decision which should shake up some of the combat we've seen recently. And before we continue, yes, I know lightsaber whip doesn't make sense. It's either a saber or a whip. It's technically a light whip. I'm going to be calling it lightsaber whip throughout the rest of the battle. Feel free to call me stupid down in the comments. Anyway, what some of you are probably shouting at your computers is that lightsaber whips were certainly not invented by the High Republic and were not first used by Vernestra Roh. In fact, lightsaber whips are nearly as old as Star Wars. The first appearance of a lightsaber whip was in the classic Star Wars Marvel comics, which hold a dear place in my heart, of course. I've talked about them on the channel many times. But the first user appeared in 1977, and that was Lumaya. Luke duels Lumaya on several occasions, and the whip is not just different from a functional standpoint, but it adds a completely different visual feel to their battles, culminating with their final duel on Kinaween, which is so cool looking. What's interesting about Lumaya and her whip is that despite first appearing in a comic in the 70s, then sort of disappearing, she was actually revived for the Legacy of the Force series, where she returns as a major antagonist, and we see lots more duels against her and her lightsaber whip. In fact, Luke even retrieves the weapon he used in that battle, his Shoto, short lightsaber, to aid him in battle. The Shoto really helps manage the sort of unpredictable, wide-sweeping nature of the whip itself. And how does the whip work? Well, at least in Legends, Legacy of the Force gives us some nice detail. Some people assume it's sort of just a free-flowing lightsaber blade. Not quite. The way I imagine it is a bunch of very small lightsaber emitters hooked together, and that kind of matches the description we get in Legacy of the Force. Mara didn't take the lightsaber whip lightly. It was the worst of both worlds. Leather strips studded with impervious Mandalorian iron fragments and tendrils of sheer, raw, murderous, dark energy. Mara drew her blaster and rolled under the hull of the ship next to her. The light whip gouged through the durasteel with the shriek of tearing metal, filling the air with the smell of hydraulic fluid. The whip is unique in that it is not simply an energy weapon. It's the actual physical whip segments with the energy surrounding it. That's why, for example, the whip has a loud crack sound when used, like a real-world whip. When Lumaya uses the weapon, she often attacks in wide, sweeping arcs, using the whip to control space and territory, then going on the offensive with the whip's unpredictable nature. 1, 2, 3, 4, she blocked him, handle held this way then that, using the whip like a short lightsaber to deflect him. As you can see, it's a versatile and useful tool. I imagine the main weaknesses have to do with up-close combat. Whip needs to be swung a certain way. It can especially be countered with the Shoto as well. But I mean, the element of surprise is worth a lot. Sort of the same with the double lightsaber. As a Jedi, you probably spend most of your time preparing to fight in one-on-one battle against a Sith or Dark Jedi, someone with a traditional lightsaber. Anything else, and you're starting to get a little uncomfortable, I think. Unsurprisingly, the Darth Bane book, which breaks down a ton of how Force-based combat works, actually goes into the lightsaber whip as one of the Sith students, Githany, chooses one over a standard lightsaber. And when I mentioned how it's similar to a double blade, that's a connection also made by this story. I'll read a quote. Like Githany's whip, Bane explained, Githany eschewed traditional weaponry in favor of the very rare energy whip, just one of the many traits which made her stand out from the other apprentices. It operated on the same basic principles of a lightsaber, but instead of a steady beam, the energy of the crystals was projected in a flexible ribbon that would twist, turn, and snap in response to both Githany's physical movements and her use of the Force. Exactly. The energy whip is far less efficient than any of the lightsaber blades. However, nobody ever practices against the whip. Githany knows that her enemy's confusion at being confronted with the whip gives her an edge. We see that with Luke as well when facing Lumaya. The first time they battle in the Marvel Comics, he gets his butt kicked once he finally gets that Shoto, he's able to defeat her. There are, of course, other exotic lightsaber weapons. There was the dual phase lightsaber, which could drastically change its length, things like the cross-guarded lightsaber that we see in the sequel trilogy, of course, and even things like lightsaber scythes or pikes. Purists won't like this, and I understand why. I think you could argue that all of these sort of take away from the purity of the lightsaber as a weapon of the Jedi as implied by the original trilogy, but it's also cool to have some different variants as well. By the way, in that first Darth Bane book, I'll always remember the part when Githany's in a duel and someone misjudges one tendril on her whip. It takes their eye out, and then while screaming in pain, another tendril basically cuts their neck open. It's a pretty brutal weapon, but it's also not like death by 1,000 cuts, because at the end of the day, it's still a lightsaber. One good shot, that's all you need. This, however, has been mostly Legends information so far. You can imagine a lightsaber whip, even when not turned on, would probably still technically be a weapon. It would be essentially an ordinary whip. That's how I imagine it, at least. Star Wars canon, I'm not sure if it's going to do the same thing. The whip seems to just be a flexible lightsaber. It's described as like multiple containment fields. There's, one piece of art of Vernestra Roh with the lightsaber whip, and it just looks like a flaccid lightsaber. Now, apparently the whip will actually be appearing in the Acolyte. Presumably it will see some action. I think it's going to be very important for the visuals of this to be right, and I don't really care whether they stick to the Legends look or the canon look. I certainly don't want them to follow continuity if it means making something goofy. I think they really need to nail this, because if they don't, it will just look stupid. Like, again, it's a lightsaber, but flaccid. I think the best and coolest way to implement this would be the Lumaya method, where it's not just a single blade, but like a crackling, many-tailed thing. Less of a purely elegant weapon and something completely different. Vernestra's is more like the kind of whip you'd use when racing on an animal. I don't know if that will look good or not. I also don't like the idea of an ordinary lightsaber being able to transform into a whip either. I think that's a little bit goofy, but the idea of a laser whip generally, I don't think it should be written off, and I certainly don't think it should be used as ammunition against Disney. They didn't invent it. Now, if it doesn't end up looking good in the show, hey, feel free to criticize that, but those are sort of my thoughts. Let me know what you think down below.